This is the World One Era, Part 2, where we expand on the causes of the war and go into how the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip and the Black Hand create a world war situation. So Austria-Hungary, remember that Franz Ferdinand, who was assassinated in his car, and his wife, Sophia, were the heirs to the throne of Austria-Hungary. Now, they blame Serbia for the assassination. They don't even like Franz Ferdinand, for the record. Austria-Hungary is not fond of him. He's the nephew of the current leader, but the blood heir, the guy who's bound to take over. But they've been looking to teach Serbia a lesson for a while, and it was Serbians who were responsible for the assassination. Now, they weren't representing Serbia necessarily. They were representing the terrorist organization, the Black Hand. But the Black Hand's goal was Serbian nationalism. So they blamed Serbia. And they demanded that Serbia turn over Gavrilo Princip for trial and that the Serbian government cease its support for terrorism. So what they've just done here is give an ultimatum. They basically say, if you don't do all of these things that we demand you do, then we're going to do something else. That's what an ultimatum is. So they demanded a whole bunch of stuff. And the other thing, one of the things that they demanded was that Gavrilo Princip be turned over by the Serbians for trial. Now, he's been arrested, and the Austro-Hungarian or the Serbians want to try him themselves. The Austro-Hungarians don't want to hear that, and they want to put him on trial. Well, Serbia gave in on pretty much everything that Austria-Hungary wanted, except for turning over Gavrilo Princip. He was kind of a hero in Serbia, and the Austro-Hungarians wanted to make an example out of him, so Serbia said no. So Austria-Hungary goes to their teammate and leader of the bad guys team, leader of the Central Powers, Germany, and they asked permission for Germany to back them and allow them to declare war on Serbia. And so Germany basically gives them what is called a blank check. They said, do what you got to do. Go in and take care of what you got to take care of. We have your back. So the first step of this becoming a world war is Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, and Germany is okay with it. Now, here's the problem for Germany. Russia looks at Serbia as like its little brother. Okay, there's a long history of Russia protecting the region that is currently being called Serbia. So Russia sees a potential problem where Austria-Hungary is going to invade their little brother, and Germany's backing Austria-Hungary. So Russia decides to stand up for their little brother, Serbia, and started to mobilize its military. Okay, what we mean by mobilize is to organize and prepare their troops for war. And they actually started sending them to the border of Russia and Germany. So Germany finds out that Russia is getting their troops prepared for war and starting to send them toward the border, and they're not happy about it. They want this to just be a fight between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Russia doesn't listen to Germany. As Germany demands that they stop, Russia says "niet," as the Russians would. And Germany all of a sudden declares war on Russia. So now we have Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia and Germany declaring war on Russia. So this conflict is growing. Now, France sees what's going on, and France is in an alliance with Russia. Remember, they're part of the Triple Entente, and this is where the alliance system becomes a problem. Remember, we said that in the first lecture, that the system of alliances creates potentially a chain reaction. An attack on one would be considered an attack on all, and that's what happens here. Germany has declared war on Russia. Russia and France are teammates, So France starts to mobilize its military. Now, this creates a bigger problem for Germany because Germany's right in the middle of Europe. And the Triple Entente has nations that are on both the west side of Germany and the east side of Germany. And they do not want to get stuck fighting a war on two fronts. And so here you can see where everybody is. France clearly labeled over here. Okay, here's Russia over here. And here's Germany and Austria-Hungary. Here's a little Serbia down here. Okay. And so what has happened is now Austria-Hungary, where my cursor go? There it is. Austria-Hungary has declared war on Serbia. That doesn't mean they threw a punch or they fired any weapons at them. They've just declared war. It's basically a formality. Then Germany sees that Russia is mobilizing, so Germany declares war on Russia. France and Russia are on the same team, so France starts to mobilize its army. Now the problem is Germany is stuck in the middle. And Germany and Austria-Hungary together had the biggest, baddest army at the time. But your army is only half as strong as it could be if you have to send half of it to France and half of it to Russia. So they need to come up with a plan in order to not have this two-front war problem. And you may have noticed the name of the plan was actually on that last slide. It's called the Schlieffen Plan. And it's named after the general that comes up with the plan. The plan was this. I'm going to go back to the map. The plan is basically, since Russia is so big, and it's going to take Russia so long to mobilize and get their soldiers ready to go and for Germany to fight them, Germany's not really worried about Russia just yet. So they only leave some small bands of soldiers along the German-Russian border here, and they're not really worried about Russia right now. But they find out that France is starting to mobilize. So they figure if we can invade France as quick as possible, knock out France. And the way you knock out the enemy back then is you take the capital city, which is right in this area here, it's Paris. You take the capital city, and basically by taking the capital city, you rip the heart out of the enemy and you take away their will to fight. That's the goal. So the plan is for Germany to go in and beat up France as fast as possible, and then to get their soldiers, get control of France, get their soldiers on a train and choo all the way over here to Russia, and then take care of the Russians. So they want to take care of one front first and then go to Russia. Okay. Now the Germans have a small problem with this plan. France, there's some natural boundary issues right in this area. Okay. In this area, we have the Alps, which is a huge mountain range. We have a dense forest, and we have a lot of wetlands. So this area, the German-French border, right in here, is very difficult to attack through because of the natural boundaries. It's hard to get an army and weapons, and then eventually tanks through the mountains and the dense forest and the wetlands that are all in here. So the easy path for Germany to get into France, where it's the most flat and they don't have the issue with the mountains and the wetlands and the forests, is through this nation right here. Okay, this is Belgium right here. So they're going to try to go through Belgium and then take France. They're still going to send some small bands of soldiers this way, but in the end, they have to go through Belgium to get to France and then eventually try to take the capital city of Paris, and then send their guys over to Russia by train. That's the plan. So you can see it's first strike strategy to attack and defeat the French quickly while Russia is taking a long time to mobilize because it's just such a big country. Then turn their attention to the Russians. And you can see they're going to work their way through Belgium, and they expect this to be a quick fight. Belgium, those crazy waffle throwing Belgians, they're not going to put up much of a fight as far as the Germans are concerned. And then once they get in here, they're going to look to take Paris, control the main waterways of France, rip the heart out of the enemy and their will to fight, and then send the guys by train back over to Russia. So you can see there they passed through Belgium, which was neutral, okay, to get to France. Now, here's the thing about Belgium. Belgium, right here, is an ally. It's neutral, so they don't want to get involved. Okay, but when Germany goes through Belgium, now Belgium is kind of under attack, and their main ally in all this is across this little body of water right here. It's this nation right over here. This is Great Britain. So they have an alliance set up with Great Britain. And remember, Great Britain is part of the team with France and with Russia on the other side of Germany, Triple Entente. Belgians' deal with the British is if they get attacked, the British are going to get involved in the fight. And that's exactly what happens. Belgium is an ally of Great Britain. Belgium gets passed through by the Germans on their way to France. And the Belgians actually stood up for themselves and fought back against the Germans. And they were completely outmanned and outnumbered and outgunned. I guess outmanned and outnumbered are the same thing. But they did slow down the German attack. And this Schlieffen plan was built on speed. They had to take France and Paris as quick as possible so they could get the guys back over to Russia. When the Belgians fight back, it slows things down. Britain enters the war, and Russia has a problem. And within a week, all of the great European powers are now drawn into the war. All the big nations of Europe are on one side or the other, and they're all involved in fighting. You have the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the Allies, Russia, France, Britain, and Serbia. Also, technically, I guess, Belgium. Now, nobody expected this thing to become this giant world war and for it to go on for years like it is going to. Both sides expected a swift victory and that war would only last a few months. When the Schlieffen plan fails, because they get slowed down on their way through Belgium, and the British showed up in France, the Germans never actually get to Paris. They never actually take Paris. They're entrenched firmly in France, and they're fighting the British and the French in France. But their plan was slowed down. Now, meanwhile, the Russian military is still mobilizing on the other side and is having some victories against the small bands of soldiers that the Germans left over there on the Eastern Front. So now the Germans have to take some more of their soldiers from the Western Front, from France, and send them over to Russia sooner than they wanted to. Well, this is where we get the stalemate of World War I and basically what this war is going to be from 1915 to 1919. Both sides dig in, like literally dig in and dig these giant trenches in France. Now, France is best known for, well, one of the things France is best known for is their wine. And one of the reasons you can grow these amazing grapes in France is because of the soil. It's very soft soil, very fertile soil, very mineral rich soil, but it also makes it very easy to dig into. So this is where both sides start digging these deep trenches. And you can see what ends up happening is, so like the Germans would be on this side over here, okay? And then this is what is called no man's land. This is the area between the two sides. One side here, with their trench here, their frontline trench, or their firing trench, and then this area of no man's land. This is the land that they're fighting over, and the guys it's just a destroyed piece of land. You'll see pictures of it. And then there's the good guys. There's us. There's the British and the French. I say us because eventually the United States will be there, but it's going to be a few years. So this is their firing trench, and then they have these connecting trenches to get from trench to trench. And then the second row of trenches, and these things go for miles and miles and miles, is what is called the support trench. Then you have some more connecting trenches. Then you have, and these connecting trenches are called, as you can see, communication trenches. So we can send information back and forth, or guys can get from one trench to the other. And then you're going to get to what is the reserve trench back here. This is where the guys are resting up. And then what happens is they get rotated from the resting trench to the front line. And then if you survive the front line trench, then you move back to the support trench. And then from the support trench, you move back to the reserve trench. And it's every so often that they rotate you out. If you're in this trench here, right here, this is where, when the whistle is blown, your commanding officer is taking you over the top, where you climb out of your trench and you go through the barbed wire, which is here, and then you go try to get across no man's land, and then you try to get through this barbed wire, and then you try to get down into their trenches and try to kill their guys and take their trench. Meanwhile, these guys are firing at you as that's happening, and your side is trying to launch cover fire and artillery fire from here, and the support trench is trying to launch fire so that the enemy stays down over here. it becomes this gruesome, gruesome fight. If you got a chance to see the movie that came out pre pre quarantine, pre COVID, um, it's called 1917. I think you can get it on pretty much anything now, on Netflix or on demand or Redbox or anything. 1917 does an amazing job of, first of all, it's a great story, but it takes you into the trenches and shows you what the trenches actually looked like, and what it was like for these guys in the trenches. And you can see that's what it was like in the trenches right there. It was muddy ground. You threw whatever you could on the ground to keep yourself from being in the mud, and that includes dead bodies of guys that were on your team and that have died. And instead of walking in the mud and stuff, you'd rather walk on them. It's kind of gross, but that's what you got to do. Meanwhile, while you're in there, you also have some furry friends snuggling up with you at night, because you're sleeping in those trenches too. And those rats, there were rats everywhere. And again, when they blow that whistle, you go over the top, and you're going to try to cross no man's land, and good luck, because many times it was just a suicide mission. So we end up with what is called a stalemate on the Western Front. It's a situation where neither side could gain an advantage, and they just for years are going to fight over the same destroyed pieces of land, from these trenches. That's actual pictures of no man's land. You can see there's just dead bodies. There's dead horses. There's it's just barren wasteland. There's another image of no man's land. Again, the movie 1917 would really give you a good idea as to what it was like. And it's a fantastic story, like I said before. Over on the Eastern Front, a whole different type of fighting. We don't really have trench warfare over there because the ground isn't as soft as it is over in France. But over in the Eastern Front, we have a Russian army that is not really good. It's poorly trained. It's not well armed. They don't have a lot of good weapons. They did have some early victories because the Germans didn't have a lot over there. Remember, they sent everybody at France, and they just left a couple bands of soldiers over to fight the Russians. Well, they learned their lesson. They learned that the Russians were better than they thought, and that they mobilized quicker than they thought. And because of Belgium and Britain, France didn't go as fast as they thought it would in the Schlieffen Plan, so they ended up having to send some guys back over. So Germany sent soldiers earlier than expected from the west over to the east, and they pushed the Russian army back. Now, as the war is going on, more and more teammates are being added. In the end, like to the Allies team is going to have like 35, I think 30, 32 maybe nations on the good guys team. But just to give you a quick, some quick info here, some new participants, and you can see Ottoman Empire, which is here represented by Turkey right here, and the Ottoman Empire keeps going this way. But the Ottoman Empire, which is Turkey and others, and Bulgaria right here, these guys are going to join the Central Powers. Okay, and then you have Romania over here, and Italy, which is down here, join with Britain, France, and Russia, and Serbia, and Belgium, right? All the guys we talked about before. Now, Italy, it used to be a friend and an ally with Germany, Austria, Hungary. They were the Triple Alliance, and then they quit. And well, actually, it was Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, and then Russia quits, and then later Italy's in there, and then they quit, and then so now Italy ends up joining on the Allies team, the good guys team, the team that we're going to join. And you can see there's other nations there too. I'm just trying not to make it too complicated. Both sides were hoping that adding allies would launch attacks and break the stalemate. However, all this did was prolong the war. So when we talked about militarism, we kind of covered all this stuff. So I'm not going to really spend a lot of time here, but modern warfare was brutal. Weapons were never able to kill their enemy so efficiently before. They have these new killing machines, basically machine guns and rapid fire artillery and hand grenades and artillery shells and poison gas. War before this, even into the Spanish-American War and the Civil War, which was not that many years. The Civil War was 35, 50 years earlier, and the Spanish-American War was 20 years earlier. in those wars, you had to really get close to your enemy to kill them. Like you looked them in the eye and shot at them or stabbed them or hit them with something. Now with these new weapons, you're able to attack your enemy from a great distance, and it I hate to say it, maybe it makes it easier, but I guess it probably does when you don't have to look your enemy in the face and you can just drop or send grenades and bombs and poison gas and hit them with machine guns that fire weapons that fire bullets at such a fast rate. And again, soldiers were going over the top and charging across no man's land, and that was just, like I said, mostly suicide missions. And it resulted in just mounting piles of dead infantry, dead soldiers. And when things aren't going well, soldiers don't feel good about themselves, and that's called morale. How you feel about yourself is your morale. If you don't have good morale, if you're a soldier and your morale is bad, how you feel about yourself is bad, bad things tend to happen to you. And the opposite is also true. When your morale is good, then it seems like good things seem to happen to you too, and you tend to have good luck. But in this particular situation, the stalemate is continuing. Now, over in America, or here, Americans were following the war in the newspapers with growing alarm. And the problem is that remember who's in America at this time. It's a lot of European immigrants, people who are either first generation, second or third generation immigrants who have family, very close family, still over in Europe. So they felt personally involved. A third of our population in this country were immigrants or the children of immigrants. So people in this country, if you had German or Irish ancestry, if you came from those regions, you tended to side with the Central Powers. You didn't have to, but the majority tended to side with the Central Powers. And most others opposed the Central Powers and were on the side of Britain and France and Russia. Some saw the Germans as people with frightening militarism and cold blooded efficiency. Now, this was aided because of the way the war was being reported. Remember, most immigrant groups from Europe are against Germany in this situation. So, a lot of the worst stories that were coming into the paper reported by these journalists were pro Allies, anti Germany and Austria Hungary. And these articles were oftentimes not even true. They were what we call propaganda, information intended to try to get your public opinion to sway one way or another. Well, President Wilson is watching this as well, but he's so afraid to get us involved in a war, and he's trying to keep America out of this. I mean, we are separated by this giant Atlantic Ocean, and he's hoping that we can continue to remain isolated. He declares our neutrality. He says we are a neutral nation. However, we do have investment. We have a lot of businesses in this country who had money invested over in Europe, and they're afraid that if the wrong side wins, then they're going to lose all their money, their investment over in Europe. Americans here were protesting the war and tried to act as a peacemaker, but it wasn't working. American business leaders welcomed neutrality, but urged President Wilson to be prepared to help Britain, especially Britain and France, if necessary. And so Wilson did give in and formed something called the National Security League, where basically we were preparing for war on a number of levels, and then we were setting up camps to train U.S. soldiers in case we're ready to go. However, one of the things that you should learn about American history is it's always important to know when the elections are for president, because our presidents tend to make different decisions because of the election year. For example, 1916, Woodrow Wilson is running for re-election. Well, if he gets us involved in war, there's a good chance he may not get reelected, especially if the war is not going well. So by maintaining our neutrality and saying that the United States is going to stay isolated, he is going to campaign on the idea of keeping us out of war. And a peace movement also became very active within the United States.